Welcome to Story Planet, where we bring you soothing tales to help you unwind. Tonight's story is The Snowfall Letters. So, settle in, get cozy, and let yourself drift into a world of mystery and light. Feel the crisp touch of the snow, the glow of heartfelt connections, and the warmth of a story crafted to bring you peace. Now, let's begin. The first snowfall of the season had arrived overnight, blanketing the quiet village of Silver Hollow in a soft, pristine white. Helen stood by her frosted window, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of chamomile tea. The gentle glow of the morning sun reflected off the snow-covered roofs, casting a serene light that made the world outside seem untouched and magical. Her cottage, nestled at the edge of the woods, felt cozy and inviting. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the faint scent of cinnamon lingered from the bread she had baked the night before. Yet, despite the warmth, Helen couldn't shake the feeling that something unusual was about to happen. There was a stillness in the air, an anticipation she couldn't quite place. She set her tea down on the windowsill and tightened her shawl around her shoulders. Stepping outside, she inhaled deeply, the crisp winter air filling her lungs. The snow crunched softly beneath her boots as she walked toward the edge of her porch. It was then that she noticed it, a small brown envelope partially hidden in the snow by her door. Helen frowned and picked it up, brushing off the snowflakes that clung to its surface. The envelope was unmarked, with no return address or stamp, just her name written in elegant, looping handwriting. Her heart skipped a beat as she turned it over in her hands. Who could have left it here? Curiosity tingling at the edges of her mind, she stepped back inside and closed the door behind her. The warmth of the cottage enveloped her as she carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of thick, cream-colored paper. The handwriting on it was the same as on the envelope, and as Helen began to read, her breath caught in her throat. The letter described a memory she had almost forgotten. A day from her childhood spent ice skating on the frozen lake with a friend. The writer mentioned the laughter they shared, the way the sun glistened on the ice, and the hot cocoa they drank afterward. Helen's chest tightened. The details were so vivid, as if the writer had been there with her. But there was no name, no signature. Just a simple closing line. Sometimes the past finds its way back to us. Helen read the letter again, her fingers trembling slightly. The handwriting seemed faintly familiar, but she couldn't place it. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the words on the page, as a flurry of questions filled her mind. Who had written this? How did they know about that day at the lake? And why now? She placed the letter on the table and gazed out at the snow-covered trees. The world outside seemed so peaceful, yet her thoughts were anything but. She had lived in Silver Hollow for most of her life, and though she cherished its tranquility, this mysterious letter stirred something deep within her, a mixture of nostalgia and unease. The day passed slowly, with Helen unable to focus on her usual routine. She tried knitting by the fire, but her hands kept faltering. She baked another loaf of bread, hoping the familiar rhythm would calm her, but the questions in her mind refused to quiet. By evening, the snow had begun to fall again, blanketing the village in an even thicker layer of white. Helen sat by the window, watching the snowflakes drift lazily to the ground. She couldn't help but wonder if another letter would appear. When morning came, Helen's curiosity was rewarded. As she opened her door to collect firewood, she found a second envelope resting on her porch. This one was sealed with a small wax stamp in the shape of a snowflake. Her heart raced as she picked it up and hurried inside. The letter inside described another memory, this time of a winter festival in the village square. The writer spoke of the twinkling lights strung between the trees, the sound of carolers singing, and the warmth of a shared cup of mulled cider. Helen's chest tightened as she read the words. She remembered that festival vividly, and the way her friend had taken her hand and led her to the dance floor under the soft glow of lanterns. It had been a moment of pure joy, a memory she hadn't thought about in years. But again, the letter was unsigned. Helen placed it beside the first one on her table, staring at the two pieces of paper as if they might offer answers. The handwriting was the same, and the emotions behind the words felt so personal, so real. She couldn't shake the feeling that these letters were meant to remind her of something, or someone. The snow continued to fall outside, creating a hushed world of white. Helen sat by the fire, her thoughts drifting between the past and the present. Whoever was leaving these letters seemed to know her heart better than she did herself. And as much as the mystery unsettled her, she couldn't deny the warmth they brought, like a soft glow in the cold of winter. Helen woke to the soft, pearly light of another snow-covered morning. The storm had passed in the night, leaving behind drifts that sparkled under the winter sun. She lay in bed a moment longer, letting the quiet fill her, before rising and wrapping herself in her thick woolen robe. The house was cold in the mornings, but she found comfort in the ritual of lighting the fire and waiting for it to warm the room. She moved about her small kitchen, the rhythm of her routine steadying her thoughts. Tea brewed, bread toasted, and the familiar crackle of the fire slowly lulled her into a sense of calm. But as she turned to fetch wood from the porch, her heart quickened. There, nestled against the doorframe, was another envelope. This one was different. It was tied with a ribbon, soft blue against the white paper, and it glistened faintly as if it had been left in the snow for just a moment too long. Helen paused, her hand hovering over the doorknob, before she finally reached for it. Her breath caught in her chest as she brought it inside and untied the ribbon. The letter inside was written in the same elegant handwriting. This time, the writer described a moonlit evening, years ago, when the lake had frozen so solid it reflected the stars above like a mirror. Helen remembered it vividly. She had stood on the ice that night, holding the hand of someone she hadn't thought about in years. The writer's words captured every detail: the crunch of snow underfoot, the icy sting of the wind, and the warmth of shared laughter that seemed to chase the cold away. Helen sat down slowly, the letter trembling in her hands. It wasn't just the memory that struck her, but the way it was written, as though the writer had been standing beside her, experiencing it all. She placed the letter on the table next to the others, her mind swirling with questions. Who was leaving these? How did they know so much about her life? And why did it feel so personal? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Helen's heart leapt, and for a moment, she thought she might find the mysterious letter leaver standing on her porch. But when she opened the door, it was only Mrs. Turner, from down the road, bundled in her usual layers and holding a basket of freshly baked scones. "Good morning, dear," Mrs. Turner chirped, her cheeks rosy from the cold. "Thought you might enjoy a bit of company and a warm bite to eat." Helen smiled and welcomed her in. The two women sat by the fire, chatting about the village and the weather. Helen debated mentioning the letters, but decided against it. It felt too private, too precious to share just yet. "Are you all right, dear?" Mrs. Turner asked, her sharp eyes studying Helen closely. "You seem a bit distracted." Helen hesitated, but nodded. "I'm fine, just caught up in my thoughts, I suppose." Mrs. Turner didn't press further, and after finishing her tea, she excused herself, leaving Helen alone once more. The house felt quieter after her departure. The ticking of the clock on the mantel the only sound. Helen returned to the table and reread the 3 letters. Each one seemed to weave a thread back through her life, connecting her to moments she had cherished but had long since buried under the weight of time. She traced her fingers over the handwriting, her mind grasping for a face to match the words. That evening, as the snow began to fall again, Helen found herself walking toward the frozen lake. The path was familiar, though she hadn't walked it in years. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that bit at her cheeks and turned her breath to mist. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches heavy with snow. When she reached the lake, she paused, her gaze sweeping over the vast frozen expanse. It looked just as it had in the letter, the ice glimmering faintly under the pale light of the rising moon. She stood there for a long time, the quiet enveloping her like a blanket. And though she was alone, she felt a strange sense of anticipation, as if someone might appear at any moment. The letters had stirred something in her, a longing, perhaps, or a sense of possibility. Helen didn't know who was behind them, but she couldn't deny the warmth they brought to her heart. As she turned to head home, she made a silent promise to herself. She would uncover the truth, no matter where it led her. Back at the cottage, Helen lit a candle and placed it on the windowsill. It was an old habit, something she'd done as a child whenever she wanted to call someone home. As the flame flickered against the glass, Helen sat by the fire, her thoughts drifting between the past and the present, her heart open to whatever the snow might bring. The wind howled softly through the trees as Helen sat in her armchair, the letters spread out on the table before her. The fire's warmth seemed to sharpen her focus, but no matter how many times she reread the elegant script, no clear answers emerged. Each letter carried the same poignant sense of familiarity, like a melody she could hum but not name. The snow outside had begun to fall again, drifting in lazy spirals against the window pane. Helen's thoughts churned like the snowstorm beyond her walls, filled with fragments of memories and unanswered questions. The house felt larger and quieter than usual, as if it too were waiting for something to reveal itself. Then came the knock at the door. Helen froze, her heart quickening. The knocks were deliberate and measured, not the hurried raps of a neighbor seeking shelter or assistance. For a moment she hesitated, her hand hovering over the letters. What if it was the person behind them? Could she finally get the answers she so desperately sought? She rose slowly and made her way to the door. When she opened it, the icy wind rushed past her, but there was no one there. Her gaze fell to the snow-covered porch, where another envelope lay nestled in the corner, this time accompanied by a small box tied with a ribbon. She brought the items inside, her fingers trembling as she shut the door against the cold. The envelope bore her name once again, written in the same elegant handwriting. Setting the box aside for the moment, she opened the letter and began to read. It described a memory she had long tucked away, a winter evening when she had danced in the town square during the annual festival. The writer mentioned the soft glow of lanterns strung between the trees, the sound of violins, and the way her laughter had mingled with the music. Helen's heart ached at the vividness of the recollection. She could almost hear the notes and feel the chill of the air against her skin. The letter ended differently this time, however. Below the signature line was a name. Thomas. Helen sat down heavily in her chair, the name echoing in her mind. Thomas. It had been years since she'd spoken it aloud. He had been her closest companion during her youth, a boy with a quick smile and a knack for mischief. They had spent countless winters together, skating on the frozen lake and wandering the snowy woods. But life had a way of scattering people like leaves in the wind. She had lost touch with him after he moved away, their connection fading into the background of adulthood. Setting the letter down, Helen turned her attention to the box. Untying the ribbon carefully, she lifted the lid to reveal its contents, a delicate porcelain snowflake ornament. It was painted in soft shades of blue and silver, and etched along the edges was a single word, remember. Her breath caught as she traced her fingers over the fragile piece. Memories of her childhood with Thomas came rushing back in vivid detail. They had once spent hours crafting paper snowflakes during a snowstorm, decorating her parents' small kitchen with their creations. It had been Thomas who insisted that every snowflake, even the ones made of paper, deserved a unique touch. Helen's thoughts were interrupted by a flicker of light from the candle on the windowsill. She glanced up to see the flame dancing in the draft, as though it too were alive with anticipation. A warmth spread through her chest, one that had nothing to do with the fire burning in the hearth. The name on the letter, the snowflake in the box, the memories they evoked, it all felt like a bridge stretching between the past and the present. She leaned back in her chair, cradling the snowflake ornament in her hands. The snow outside fell thicker now, shrouding the village in an almost otherworldly silence. Helen's heart felt lighter, though her questions remained. Was Thomas truly here, in Silver Hollow? And if so, why had he chosen now to reach out? As the night deepened, Helen placed the snowflake on the mantel beside the letters. The fire crackled softly, its golden light casting shadows that danced across the walls. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of wonder, as though the snow itself carried promises waiting to be fulfilled. She would wait, she decided. The answers would come in their own time, just as the snow always returned each winter. And as she closed her eyes, the sound of the wind outside carried a faint whisper, one that seemed to say, "This is only the beginning." The days that followed were cloaked in an atmosphere of quiet anticipation. Helen's small cottage, usually a haven of routine, now felt charged with an invisible energy. Each morning she awoke to the hope and dread of finding another letter waiting on her porch. And every evening she sat by the fire, rereading the ones she already had, turning their words over in her mind like a puzzle she couldn't solve. By the third day, another envelope appeared. This one was tucked beneath a pile of firewood she had left near the edge of her porch. Helen's heart leapt when she saw it, the now familiar script on the front addressing her by name. But as she opened it, her excitement mingled with confusion. The letter was shorter than the others, containing only a single line. "Come to the clearing beneath the pine grove at dusk." Helen's fingers tightened around the paper as she reread the words. The pine grove was a place she hadn't visited in years. It was tucked away on the outskirts of the village, hidden by dense woods that seemed to whisper secrets with every gust of wind. The last time she'd been there she was just a girl, and Thomas had been by her side, daring her to race him through the snow-covered trees. That memory played vividly in her mind as the afternoon light began to fade. She dressed warmly, pulling on her thickest boots and a scarf that wrapped snugly around her neck. The snow crunched beneath her feet as she walked, the cold air sharp against her cheeks. The world around her seemed to hold its breath, the only sounds her measured footsteps and the occasional rustle of a bird taking flight. When she reached the pine grove, the clearing was bathed in the soft orange glow of the setting sun. The tall trees stood like sentinels, their branches heavy with snow, and there at the center of the clearing was a small wooden table. On it rested another envelope and a steaming thermos, the faint scent of spiced cider wafting through the crisp air. Helen hesitated, her breath visible in the cold as she approached the table. She picked up the envelope, her heart pounding as she unfolded the paper inside. This time, the letter was different. It wasn't a memory or an invitation, but a question. "Do you believe in second chances?" Helen's breath caught in her throat. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the words as the sun dipped lower behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. The question lingered in her mind, echoing with a weight she hadn't anticipated. Did she believe in second chances? And if so, what would it mean to embrace one now? As if in answer, a figure emerged from the trees. Helen's head snapped up, her fingers tightening instinctively around the letter. The figure was bundled in a thick coat and scarf, but even from a distance, there was something achingly familiar about the way they moved, the way they stood with their hands shoved deep in their pockets. "Helen," the figure called, their voice carrying across the clearing like a warm breeze cutting through the chill. Her heart seemed to stop and race all at once. The figure stepped closer, the details of their face coming into focus. It was Thomas. Older, yes, with lines around his eyes and a touch of gray at his temples, but unmistakably him. The boy she had known, now a man, standing before her in the fading light of the day. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, his voice soft and steady. Helen's mouth opened, but no words came out. She stared at him, her mind racing to reconcile the man before her with the boy she had carried in her memories for so long. I got your letters," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas smiled, a small, almost shy curve of his lips. "I hoped you would." The silence between them stretched, filled only by the soft rustling of the trees. Helen's mind was a whirl of emotions, joy, confusion, disbelief, and a tentative hope that felt fragile enough to shatter with the wrong word. "Why now?" she asked finally, her voice trembling. "Why after all these years?" Thomas's expression grew somber. "Because I never stopped thinking about you, Helen. About us. Life pulled us apart, but it never felt right. And when I came back to Silver Hollow, it felt like a sign. Like maybe it wasn't too late to find you again." Helen's chest tightened as his words sank in. She thought of the letters, the memories they had stirred, the emotions she had long buried. Standing there in the clearing, with the snow falling softly around them, she felt something shift within her, a door opening, a light breaking through the shadows. She stepped closer to him, her voice steadier now. "I don't know what this means, Thomas. I don't know where to begin." He reached out, his gloved hand brushing lightly against hers. "Then let's begin here," he said simply. "One step at a time." Helen looked up at him, the warmth of his presence chasing away the chill in the air. And for the first time in years, she felt something she thought she had lost forever. Hope. The glow of the setting sun faded into the deep blue of twilight as Helen and Thomas stood together in the clearing. The weight of time seemed to dissolve in the stillness, leaving only the faint crunch of snow underfoot as they turned back toward the path leading out of the pine grove. "I'd almost forgotten how beautiful it is out here," Helen said, her voice soft as she glanced at the trees silhouetted against the evening sky. "It's always been beautiful," Thomas replied, his gaze fixed on her. "Sometimes we just need a reason to notice it again." Helen smiled faintly but said nothing, her thoughts swirling. As they walked, the snowflakes began to fall again, light and gentle, like whispers from the sky. The path wound through the woods, and the quiet between them felt neither awkward nor forced. It was a space filled with questions and answers yet to be spoken aloud. When they reached the edge of the village, Thomas paused. "Do you still take tea by the fire?" he asked, his voice tinged with a familiarity that tugged at Helen's heart. "Every evening," she replied, tilting her head toward the soft glow of her cottage window visible in the distance. "Would you like to join me?" Thomas nodded, a small smile curving his lips. Together, they made their way to her home. Helen busied herself lighting the fire while Thomas set the kettle to boil, the motion so natural it felt as though no time had passed at all since they had last done this. Yet, beneath the surface, 1,000 questions lingered, each waiting for the courage to be asked. When the tea was ready, they sat by the fire, the warmth of the flames casting a golden light across the room. Helen wrapped her hands around her cup, the heat seeping into her fingers as she stole a glance at Thomas. His face, lined with years of life and experience, still held the same earnest expression she remembered from their youth. "You never stopped writing, did you?" Helen asked, breaking the silence. Thomas met her gaze, his eyes soft but steady. "No. Writing has always been how I make sense of the world, and how I held on to the things I couldn't bear to let go of." Helen's throat tightened. "Including me?" He nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Especially you." For a moment, she couldn't speak. The weight of his words settled over her like the snow outside, soft yet profound. She had spent so many years believing that their connection had been lost, that life had carried them too far apart to ever find their way back. But now, sitting here with him, she realized that some bonds were never truly broken, only stretched, waiting for the right moment to be drawn together again. "Why did you stop?" she asked finally. "The letters, I mean. After you moved away, there were no more letters." Thomas sighed, his gaze dropping to his hands. "I wanted to write. Every day, I thought about it. But I was young, and I thought it would be easier, for both of us, if I didn't. I told myself it was better to let you move on." Helen's lips parted in surprise, a mixture of sadness and frustration bubbling up within her. "You didn't even give me a choice." "I know," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I've thought about that every day since. And when I came back to Silver Hollow, I knew I couldn't make the same mistake twice. That's why I wrote the letters. to remind you of what we shared, and to see if there was still a place for me in your life. Helen stared into the fire, her mind racing. The letters had stirred something in her she hadn't even realized was dormant. They had awakened memories, yes, but more than that, they had rekindled a feeling she thought she had lost long ago. Hope. And now, as Thomas sat across from her, baring his heart, she felt that hope take root. You left, she said quietly, her voice trembling. But you also came back. Thomas leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. And I'll stay, Helen. If you'll have me, I'll stay. The room fell silent again, the only sound the gentle crackling of the fire. Helen's heart was a storm of emotions, joy, fear, uncertainty, and a fragile, growing trust. She met his gaze, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. I don't know what the future holds, Thomas, she said softly, but I'd like to find out. His smile was small but genuine, a quiet promise in its simplicity. One step at a time? Helen nodded, a matching smile tugging at her lips. One step at a time. Outside, the snow continued to fall, wrapping the village in its quiet embrace. And inside the small cottage at the edge of Silver Hollow, two souls began to find their way back to each other, one step at a time. The next morning, Helen awoke to a strange quiet. The snowfall from the night before had left the village blanketed in a soft, pristine white, muffling every sound. She stayed in bed for a few moments longer than usual, staring at the patterns of frost etched across the window pane. It felt like the world outside was holding its breath. When she finally rose, the air inside the cottage was cool, but the fire from the night before had left enough warmth to keep the chill at bay. Helen moved through her morning routine, lighting the hearth, brewing her tea, and toasting a slice of bread. But her thoughts were anything but routine. They were filled with fragments of the conversation she had shared with Thomas the night before. She had never imagined that he would come back to Silver Hollow. For years, she had told herself that chapter of her life was closed, the memories tucked safely away like an old book on a high shelf. Yet now, that book had been reopened, its pages filled with the promise of a story not yet finished. Her gaze drifted to the letters still sitting on the table. She had read them so many times over the past days that she could recite them by heart. But now, with the context of Thomas's return, they took on a new meaning. They weren't just fragments of her past. They were a bridge to her present. A soft knock at the door broke her reverie. Helen's heart gave a small leap. She crossed the room and opened the door to find Thomas standing there, his cheeks pink from the cold, his breath visible in the crisp morning air. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm despite the chill. "Good morning," Helen replied, stepping aside to let him in. "I wasn't expecting you so early." Thomas shrugged off his coat, the scent of fresh snow lingering on the fabric. "I thought I'd take a walk before the village woke up, and I wanted to see you." The simplicity of his words sent a small ripple through Helen's chest. She gestured toward the kettle on the stove. "Would you like some tea?" "I'd love some," he said, settling into the chair nearest the fire. As they sat together, the warmth of the fire creating a cocoon around them, Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn journal. "I thought you might like to see this," he said, holding it out to her. Helen took the journal, her fingers brushing against the rough leather cover. "What is it?" "It's where I wrote the letters," Thomas said. "Not just the ones I sent you. All of them." Helen's breath caught as she opened the journal. The pages were filled with his handwriting, the words flowing across the paper in neat, deliberate strokes. Each letter was dated, and as she flipped through them, she realized that they spanned years. Some described his travels, others reflected on memories of their time together, and still others spoke of his longing to return to Silver Hollow. "You wrote all of these?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas nodded. "I didn't know if I'd ever send them. At first, it was just a way to feel connected to you, to hold on to the part of my life that felt the most real. But over time, it became something more. Writing to you reminded me of who I was and who I wanted to be." Helen closed the journal, her fingers lingering on the worn cover. Why did you decide to send them now? Thomas leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. Because I realized that holding on to the past wasn't enough. I wanted a future, and I hoped you might want the same. The vulnerability in his voice brought tears to Helen's eyes. She looked down at the journal in her lap, her mind spinning with the weight of his words. The letters had been a lifeline for him, a way to preserve something precious, and now they were offering her the chance to reclaim a piece of herself she hadn't even realized was missing. I don't know what to say, she admitted, her voice trembling. This is all so much. Thomas reached out, his hand covering hers. You don't have to say anything right now. I just wanted you to know the truth. Helen nodded, her fingers tightening around his. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, filling the silence between them with a comforting rhythm. For the first time in years, Helen felt a glimmer of something she had thought she had lost. The courage to embrace the unknown. They sat together for a long time, the journal resting between them like a bridge built from words and memories. Outside, the snow continued to fall, its soft whispers carrying the promise of new beginnings. Days after Thomas shared his journal with Helen, were filled with a quiet kind of warmth. Helen found herself reading through the letters again, this time with a deeper understanding of what they meant. Each one felt like a window into Thomas's heart, revealing the threads of a connection that had never truly been broken. Snow continued to fall in Silver Hollow, blanketing the village in a serene stillness. Helen found herself drawn to the outdoors more than usual. The cold air and glistening landscape seemed to echo the clarity she was beginning to feel. On one such walk, she noticed how the world seemed brighter, as if the snow had a way of magnifying the faintest light. One morning, Helen decided to visit the old bridge that spanned the frozen creek near the edge of the village. It was a place she hadn't been in years, not since she and Thomas had last walked there together as teenagers. Back then, they had spent hours tossing stones into the water below, laughing and sharing dreams of what the future might hold. When she reached the bridge, her breath caught. There, tied to the wooden railing, was a small bundle wrapped in burlap. Curious, Helen untied it and found yet another envelope tucked inside, along with a small tin of peppermint candies. She smiled at the unexpected gift, her fingers brushing over the now familiar handwriting on the envelope. The letter inside was simple but heartfelt. Thomas had written about the bridge, recalling the same moments Helen had been thinking about. He spoke of the way the creek had seemed endless to them as children, a place where they could dream without limits. His words carried a gentle reassurance, as if he wanted her to know that those dreams were still possible, even now. Helen stood on the bridge for a long time, letting the words settle into her heart. She turned the tin of candies over in her hand, marveling at how something so small could hold so much meaning. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to rekindle the kind of connection she and Thomas had shared. That evening, Helen invited Thomas over for dinner. She spent the afternoon preparing a meal that felt special without being overly elaborate. Roasted vegetables, warm bread, and a hearty stew. The act of cooking brought her a sense of peace, each step grounding her in the present. When Thomas arrived, the glow of the firelight gave the cottage an inviting warmth. They shared the meal at the small table by the hearth, their conversation flowing easily. Helen found herself laughing at Thomas's stories of his travels, the way he described each place with vivid detail and a touch of humor. After dinner, they moved to the sitting area, the journal once again resting on the table between them. Helen hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I've been thinking about the bridge," she said, "and about the dreams we used to talk about when we were younger." Thomas leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Do you remember what we used to say? About traveling the world and finding adventures?" Helen smiled. "I do. But I also remember the smaller dreams, like opening a bakery or planting a garden big enough to feed the whole village." Thomas chuckled. "You always did have the better ideas. My dreams were all about running away, but yours were about building something. They sat in silence for a moment, the crackling fire filling the space between them. Finally, Helen spoke again. Do you think it's too late? To dream, I mean. Thomas reached for her hand, his touch steady and reassuring. I don't think it's ever too late. The dreams might change, but the heart behind them doesn't. As the evening stretched on, Helen felt a sense of lightness she hadn't experienced in years. The conversation shifted to memories of their shared past, from snowy adventures to quiet moments by the lake. Each story brought with it a wave of nostalgia, but also a sense of hope for the future. Before Thomas left that night, he paused at the door. Thank you for dinner, he said, his voice soft, and for letting me be a part of your life again. Helen smiled, the warmth of his words settling over her like a blanket. I'm glad you came back, Thomas. Outside, the snow fell steadily, the world beyond the cottage glowing faintly in the moonlight. Helen stood by the window long after Thomas had gone, watching the snowflakes dance in the breeze. The letters, the journal, the moments they had shared, all of it felt like the beginning of something new, a story that was still being written. And for the first time in years, Helen felt ready to turn the page. The morning of the winter festival dawned with a clear blue sky and air so crisp it seemed to sparkle. Silver Hollow was alive with activity as villagers bustled about, preparing for the day's celebrations. The scent of mulled cider and roasted chestnuts wafted through the air, mingling with the laughter of children playing in the snow. Helen stood at her window, watching as strings of lights were hung along the rooftops, and a group of men hoisted a tall pine tree into the center of the village square. It had been years since she'd attended the festival, but today she felt a pull to be part of it. The memories stirred by Thomas's letters and their recent conversations had awakened something within her, a longing for connection, for joy. She dressed warmly in a wool coat and scarf, slipping on her sturdiest boots before stepping outside. The snow crunched beneath her feet as she made her way toward the square, the festive sounds growing louder with each step. She could see families gathered around the large tree, children chasing each other with snowballs, and stalls lining the square offering handmade crafts and warm treats. As Helen approached, she caught sight of Thomas standing near one of the stalls. He was speaking with Mrs. Turner, who ran the village bakery, and holding a steaming mug in his hands. When he saw Helen, his face lit up with a smile, and he raised his mug in greeting. Good morning, Helen, he called as she drew closer. I was beginning to wonder if you'd join us. I wouldn't miss it, she replied, her cheeks rosy from the cold and the warmth of his gaze. It's been a long time since I've seen the festival like this. Thomas handed her a second mug, the rich scent of spiced cider rising from its depths. It hasn't changed much, he said, still as magical as ever. They wandered through the square together, stopping to admire the stalls and greet familiar faces. Helen found herself laughing more than she had in years, the warmth of the cider and Thomas's presence melting away any lingering hesitations. The village square, adorned with twinkling lights and garlands of greenery, felt like something out of a storybook. Near the edge of the square, a small band was playing festive tunes. The music drew a crowd, and soon couples began to dance on the makeshift dance floor. Thomas turned to Helen, an amused glint in his eye. Shall we? Helen hesitated, her instinct to say no rising. But then she saw the mischief in his smile and felt her own lips curve in response. Why not? She said, setting her mug aside. Thomas took her hand and led her onto the dance floor. The music was lively, and though Helen's steps were hesitant at first, Thomas's easy laughter put her at ease. They moved together in a simple rhythm, their breath visible in the cold air as they twirled under the string lights. Around them, the villagers clapped and cheered, their joy infectious. As the song ended, Helen found herself breathless and smiling, her hand still in Thomas's. You've gotten better at this, she teased. Years of practice, he replied with a mock bow. But you're still the best partner I've ever had. Their laughter mingled with the sounds of the festival, and for a moment, Helen forgot the years that had passed. She felt like the girl she had once been, full of hope and light. As the evening deepened, the villagers gathered around the towering pine tree for the lighting ceremony. Helen and Thomas stood near the front, their shoulders brushing as they watched the mayor step forward to address the crowd. "Tonight, we celebrate not just the season, but the bonds that hold us together," the mayor said, his voice carrying over the quiet crowd. "Let this tree remind us of the joy in our shared traditions and the strength of our community." With that, the lights on the tree flickered to life, casting a warm glow over the square. The crowd erupted into cheers, and Helen felt a swell of emotion she hadn't expected. She glanced at Thomas, who was watching her with a soft smile. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Helen took a moment to find the right words. "I'm thinking about how much I've missed this. The village, the people, you." Thomas reached for her hand, his fingers warm against hers. "I'm glad you're here, Helen, and I'm glad we found our way back to this." As the crowd began to disperse, Helen and Thomas lingered by the tree, the glow of the lights casting soft shadows on the snow. The night was still and quiet, the kind of quiet that felt full of possibility. Helen realized she wasn't just thinking about the past anymore. For the first time in a long while, she was thinking about the future. And she wasn't afraid. The days following the winter festival were painted in shades of calm and clarity. Helen found herself walking through the snow-covered woods more often, her thoughts lingering on the warmth of that evening. The light of the festival tree, the music, and the laughter had stayed with her, like the comforting echo of a favorite melody. One crisp morning, Helen decided to revisit the lake. The frozen expanse stretched before her, shimmering under the pale winter sun. She remembered skating here as a girl, her laughter mingling with Thomas's as they glided across the ice. Now the lake seemed to hold its breath, the stillness profound and soothing. Helen walked to the bench that overlooked the lake, brushing snow from its surface before sitting down. She pulled her coat tighter around her and let her thoughts drift. The journal Thomas had shared with her still sat on her bedside table, its pages filled with words that seemed to bridge the years they had spent apart. She had read through it twice now, each letter a window into his life and heart. But as much as the journal had touched her, it also left her with questions. What had driven him to return to Silver Hollow after so long? And what did he see for their future? These questions circled in her mind, their answers just out of reach. She was lost in thought when a voice broke the quiet. "I thought I might find you here." Helen turned to see Thomas approaching, his scarf pulled high against the cold. He carried a small thermos, steam curling from its spout as he sat down beside her. "You have a knack for appearing at just the right moment," Helen said, a smile tugging at her lips. Thomas poured them both a cup of tea from the thermos. "It's a skill I've been working on," he replied lightly. Then, more seriously, he added, "This place still feels like home, doesn't it?" Helen nodded, taking a sip of the warm tea. "It does. Even after all these years, it's like the snow and the trees remember us." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the faint rustling of the wind through the pines and the occasional creak of the ice on the lake. Finally, Helen spoke. "I've been reading your journal again," she said. "It's a beautiful gift, Thomas, but it also makes me wonder. What made you come back now after all this time?" Thomas's gaze drifted to the lake, his expression thoughtful. "I've asked myself that question 100 times, he admitted. "The truth is, I think I've always wanted to come back, but life kept pulling me in different directions. It wasn't until recently that I realized what was missing." "And what was that?" Helen asked softly. "You," he said simply. "This place. The life I left behind. I thought I could find happiness elsewhere, but it never felt complete. Coming back here felt like the only way to make sense of everything." Helen looked down at her hands, her heart swelling with emotions she couldn't quite name. "I'm glad you came back," she said finally. "It's been unexpected, but good." Thomas smiled. "Unexpected can be good. It keeps life interesting." As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, painting the lake in hues of gold and pink, Helen and Thomas rose from the bench and began walking back toward the village. The snow crunched beneath their boots, and their conversation turned to lighter topics. Memories of school days, the antics of their childhood friends, and the small quirks of life in Silver Hollow. When they reached Helen's cottage, Thomas hesitated at the gate. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," he said, his tone more serious now. "What is it?" Helen asked, tilting her head slightly. "Would you come with me to the lake tomorrow evening?" he asked. "There's something I want to show you." Helen's curiosity was piqued, but she nodded. "Of course. What time?" "Just before sunset," he said. "I promise it'll be worth it." With that, he turned and made his way down the path, leaving Helen standing at the gate. She watched him until he disappeared into the soft glow of the evening snow, her mind racing with possibilities. Inside, she lit a fire and sat by the hearth, her thoughts drifting back to the lake and the unspoken promise in Thomas's words. Whatever he wanted to show her, Helen felt certain it would be another step in the story they were writing together. A story she was finally ready to embrace. The following evening, Helen wrapped herself in her warmest coat and stepped out into the snowy dusk. The sky was painted in hues of orange and violet, the kind of winter sunset that seemed to stretch endlessly across the horizon. Each breath she took came out as a soft cloud, mingling with the crisp, cold air. The path to the lake was familiar, but felt different under the light of the fading sun. The snow crunched beneath her boots, and the sound of her footsteps filled the stillness of the woods. In the distance, she could see the outline of Thomas standing by the lake, his figure silhouetted against the shimmering ice. When she reached him, he turned and smiled, his eyes reflecting the warm colors of the sky. "You made it," he said softly. "Of course," Helen replied. "What's all this about?" Thomas gestured to a small wooden box resting on the bench near the lake. "I found this in my attic when I came back to Silver Hollow. It's something I thought you might like to see." Curiosity sparked in Helen's chest as she approached the box. It was old, its wood weathered but sturdy. She lifted the lid carefully and found it filled with trinkets and keepsakes. A collection of pressed flowers, an old compass, and a bundle of photographs tied together with twine. "These were ours," Thomas said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "Things we collected when we were kids. I didn't even remember keeping them until I saw the box again." Helen picked up the bundle of photographs, her fingers brushing against the worn edges. She untied the twine and flipped through them, her breath catching as memories flooded back. There were pictures of them by the lake, their faces red from the cold but beaming with joy. Another showed them at the village festival, their arms draped around each other as they laughed at some forgotten joke. Each photograph felt like a time capsule, preserving moments she hadn't realized she'd been missing. "I can't believe you kept all of this," Helen said, her voice soft. Thomas shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "Some things are worth holding on to." Helen set the photographs down and picked up the compass. It was tarnished but still functional, its needle pointing true. She remembered the day they had found it in an old shed behind her grandparents' house. Thomas had insisted it would lead them to treasure, and they had spent the entire summer following its direction through the woods. "We never did find that treasure," Helen said with a laugh, turning the compass over in her hands. "Maybe we weren't looking in the right place," Thomas replied, his tone light but meaningful. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The weight of the past and the possibilities of the future hung between them, fragile yet full of promise. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Thomas pulled a small candle from his pocket and lit it, placing it on the edge of the bench. Its warm glow flickered against the encroaching night, casting long shadows on the snow. "I wanted to bring you here because this is where it all started," Thomas said. "All those years ago, this lake, this place, it was the heart of everything we shared, and I thought maybe it could be the start of something new." Helen's chest tightened as his words sank in. She looked out at the frozen lake, its surface reflecting the faint light of the candle and the first stars appearing in the sky. The memories of their childhood, the letters, the journal, all of it felt like pieces of a puzzle finally coming together. "I don't know what the future looks like," Helen said quietly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I know I don't want to face it alone." Thomas reached for her hand, his touch warm against the chill of the evening. "Neither do I," he said. "One step at a time?" Helen smiled, the tension in her chest easing as she squeezed his hand. One step at a time. They stayed by the lake until the stars filled the sky, their breath mingling in the cold air as they talked about everything and nothing. The candle burned low, its flame resilient against the night. And as they finally turned to leave, walking side by side along the snowy path, Helen felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the firelight. For the first time in years, she wasn't looking back or ahead. She was simply present, stepping forward into the unknown with a heart full of hope. Thank you for joining us on Story Planet. If you felt the warmth of the Snowfall Letters and found yourself wrapped in its light, consider giving a thumbs up. If this story brought you peace and calm, feel free to share it with friends and family. And don't forget to subscribe to be part of our nightly journeys, where serene tales await you every day. Wishing you a peaceful night and sweet dreams. Good night from Story Planet.